because Ben, who is a visiting scholar with us full time and soon to be doctoral student, is sharing some new findings, like super, super new. And I think he will restate the goal of the meeting, but it will be to get your feedback. And this is for those of you who are not yet in graduate school. This is kind of like what it is. This is it. Like, this is the show. Like, hey, I have data. Oh my gosh, I wonder what these data mean. So Ben, I will let you be in charge, and we will run for the full hour, but we'll have a hard stop right at 3 o'clock Eastern time.
Awesome. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. And as Angela said, for me, I think success looks like I can show you a little bit of what are we sort of planning to do on this pilot data that we have. So hopefully we can get some feedback on what does that mean, and then what should our next steps be, right? So basically this project.
Okay. I have a question right on the slides there. Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, of course.
If you're gritty, by definition, by definition, don't you love what you do?
Yes, and that is a great point. But it is not necessarily the case in the grid measurement. Like if you look at the grid items, they don't speak about loving what you do. They just say about working hard and sticking with it. So you could, like, even though sort of like theoretically it's implied that by being greedy, you're a person who loves what you do, it's not necessarily in the items themselves. But generally, like, our main aim in this project was to try to bridge sort of what we know about grit with self-determination theories, background on motivation and their motivation continuum. So I just want to like start with a brief introduction to what is self-determination theory. And that's a long tradition, not necessarily long, but a tradition in motivation science that basically has a main idea, which is that humans have basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and that determines the quality and the quantity of their motivation. And that would be like the second most important tenet of the theory, which is that it doesn't only matter how much motivation you have, but of what quality or what kind is that motivation. So they would say, first of all, you can classify motivation as extrinsic or intrinsic, and I think we're all familiar with that classification. But then this sort of like too broad sort of classification was made more granular, right? Where we have external, and that's like doing things out of fear of punishment, like a external punishment or reward. Then we have introjected, which is self-esteem and trying to prove your value. Then we have identified, which is doing something because it's important or useful to me, and intrinsic, which is doing something because it is something that I like or that I find interesting. They later sort of collapsed the two good ones and the two bad ones as autonomous versus controlled motivation. And most of self-determination theory sort of views autonomous motivation as good and controlled motivation as bad, of high versus low quality motivation, right? So whereas people would often think more motivation is always better, self-determination theory would say it's actually not the case. You want the autonomous motivation, not the controlled one. And then why is that? Because of course, that's, as the name implies, if you have autonomous motivation, you will feel more autonomous. You will have more versus less autonomy. It will feel more effortless rather than effortful. It will be more pleasant, whereas being working out of controlled motivation will feel more aversive. Autonomous motivation will lead to deep rather than superficial learning. And even like sort of pro-social outcomes, like autonomous motivation is linked to helping, whereas controlled motivation is linked to cheating. But I think for our purposes today, like this like effortful, effortless, and aversive versus pleasant sort of dichotomy, I think is the most interesting one. So we would say self-concordance if we're talking about specific goals. Say, for instance, if I asked you, what are 3 of your academic goals for the next 6 months? That would yield a self-concordance score. If I asked you for a specific domain, like why do you want to study and get good grades, that would give you a relative autonomy index once you subtract the autonomous minus the controlled, right? So if you have the autonomous motivation and you subtract the controlled motivation, then you get these scores. But for simplicity's sake, we will just speak about self-concordance. So we will call this different score self-concordance for simplicity, even though there are some like technical details about how these responses are elicited in the participant. So how does self-concordance relate to grit? I think it's interesting to look at the dictionary definition of grit, and then we can see some of the connotations of grit can be sort of somewhat negative, like abrasive particles, sharp granules, gritting one's teeth, and grating sounds. So I think that explains why in the minds of many people, when they hear the word grit and they hear grit as a psychological sort of phenomenon without being absolutely familiarized with it, they wouldn't assume what Paulo is saying, that grit sort of presupposes autonomy or loving what you do. They would rather think the contrary, right? So I've heard from researchers in the self-determination theory field to sort of equate or understand or have the suspicion that grit is actually about introjection, or grit being about external motivation, about forcing yourself to do something that you don't want to do. So that plays out with the autonomous versus controlled dichotomy. And then you sort of think, well, if grit is something that's you have to power yourself through, that you have to beat yourself in the back to do, then it's assumed, or its connotation sort of leads people to think about it in terms of controlled motivation. Yet, when you think about grit from the inside, you know that grit entails goal hierarchies, right? So goal hierarchies, by definition, are related to this idea of doing things that are important or valuable to you, which would be autonomous motivation, right? So there's like this dichotomy, or this like apparent contradiction. So what does the data say on this? Like, how does grit relate to motivation quality? And after doing some like research, there's very little information. There's few papers published, but basically what they say, for example, here we have positive relations with grit and intrinsic and identified motor regulation, which would be two of the autonomous high quality motivations. Then here we have grit being predicted actually by the motivations. So negatively by the negative motivations, and positively by the more high quality motivations. In this like huge model, we have perseverance of effort related positively to intrinsic motivation and negatively to extrinsic motivation, whereas consistency of interest would be negatively linked to extrinsic motivation. And finally, this paper sort of shows how grit explains 8.9 of the variance in academic motivation for academic goals. So basically, like what we take of this research is that we know grit and self-concordance are positively related. However, the mechanics and the sort of nuances of this relationship haven't been really studied. And also like the functional role, where we see sometimes grit predicting motivation and sometimes motivation predicting grit, and like this like functional status of grit and self-concordance is something that hasn't been really explored. So we have some preliminary data, and this is Chase and Paolo will be familiar with this data because this is the grit rubric data. But here we'll just focus on the grit and self-concordance. So here we asked 198 MTurkers aged from 23 to 73, pretty much equally dispersed by gender, their grit score, and how they, what's their self-concordance, so how autonomous manus controlled motivated they were for 3 goals they explicitly prompted themselves. So we asked them, what are 3 goals you have? And they said, I want to lose weight, I want to rock climb, and be #1 in the world for chess, right? So for these 3 goals, how self-concordant are they? And we find a positive correlation at 0.40. And if we look at passion and perseverance separately, we see that the correlation is stronger for passion than perseverance. The R's are 42 and 20. So passion is more related than perseverance with self-concordance. And I think this is interesting because it's what we would theoretically predict, passion being sort of having these connotations of doing things you love. However, let's be reminded that like in the grid scale, passion is measured as I have done this for a long time. I haven't given up on this for a long time, right? So it doesn't presuppose, our grid measure is not presupposing passion in terms of loving what you do. However, we didn't have any good dependent variables in this data set. So our next step was, well, let's try to add an outcome and see like how they would react, how they would interact, and how we can sort of understand this functional role as it relates to a dependent variable. So we initially thought, following some of the research in self-concordance, that well-being and goal attainment would be the ideal DVs, dependent variables, but we finally settled in burnout. And we predicted an interaction or a moderation where grid predicts burnout, and that is moderated by self-concordance. So here's our hypothesis. We sort of expected greedier people to be less burnt out. If you are greedy, we expect you to experience less of the burnout symptoms. However, we tried to think differently about how that would relate to self-concordance, right? So if you're a greedy person, and we expect that to mean that you will work very hard and you'll like, you exert yourself, you exert a lot of effort. So if you have low self-concordance and you're exerting a lot of effort, we expect that you will be burnt out. However, if you're very greedy, but you have high self-concordance, we would expect that this high level of self-concordance would protect you even more from burnout, right? So in a sense, we're saying, if you're greedy and self-concordant, that's the best way to be. And if you're really greedy, but your self-concordance is very low, then you're at higher risk for burnout because you're exerting yourself so much every day, doing something that feels very non-self-concordant.
So, can I ask a quick question? Oh, sorry. Go, Paolo.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Jill. Very quick question. So what does the literature say about self-concordance and burnout? Question number one. And question number two, before you said, oh, okay, there's a difference between, passion, self-concordance versus perseverance and self-concordance, but here we're going back into grid. So I was wondering if you were, like, to me, it seems to be more relevant on the dimension of passion based on what you said before. So these are my two questions.
Yeah, so for the first question, there isn't much literature specifically on self-concordance for self-defined goals and burnout, but there is a lot for autonomous and controlled motivation that we're treating now as equivalent, right? So low self-concordance, meaning high controlled motivation, is linked in the research to burnout. So it's positively linked. And for the second question, yeah, our original, like, we're working with the whole of the grid scale, even though we do have results for them separately, and we can show those later if you're interested. But that's definitely a good point. It is complicated by the fact that if we're looking for an interaction, we want the predictor and the moderator to be as independent as possible. So the fact that they're more related between them actually hurts our moderation hypothesis rather than helps it, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm.
I had a quick question about the self-concordance items. I'm just a little curious if you could tell us how you assessed it. So you briefly went over it, but are you going to go into that more? Sorry.
Yeah, right after this slide. So maybe I should have put this before, but it's such a short survey that rather than like explaining, I think the best thing that we can do is to actually take it. So let's take 2 or 3 minutes to just take a picture of this QR code. Otherwise, you can use the URL here. It's not case sensitive. And take 2 or 3 minutes to just like browse through the items and sort of take the survey and see how those things are operationalized.
So Ben, this is a survey that you showed us before, right?
Yeah.
So while the others are taking it, just a quick question. What kind of feedback do you?
I think it's going to be hard for me to listen to you ask this question and also
Okay.
survey. So can you just hold on a second?
Sure.
You can chat him though.
And to get through the branching, you have to say that you work full time, right?
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. You have to say you work full time and get more than 40 hours. So yeah, you can also ignore validation on previews. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a preview.
How about you look up at Ben in the camera when you're done? And then when like 80% of people are done, you should start talking and you can answer Paula's question if you want to. Ben?
Okay. Yeah. So Paul's question is about feedback and what sort of feedback would be most useful to me. So yeah, definitely feedback about the survey would be helpful, and then feedback about how to interpret the results we will show shortly, and then feedback about what our next steps should be. So that's the sort of feedback that would be very helpful. As Julia said, one limitation that we're having with the Qualtrics is that the auto advance is sometimes buggy. I'm working with like Qualtrics support, and hopefully we can get that fixed before running the real data with that, right? But so before advancing, does anyone have anything about the survey?
I think, Julia, is that what your comment was about, or?
Yeah, like I found that I was kind of going quick, and so sometimes I would press the wrong thing, but it would advance to the next page and I couldn't fix it. So for example, I said I think I got like 2 years of education at the end because I was going fast, but it kept going. So
Yeah, it is on auto advance, which is like when you click, you don't have to say next, but it can be buggy. And I had been a big advocate for auto advance, right? Like, in other words, as soon as you say what you're going to say, like most websites, it just like pushes you forward. If we could have, so by the way, the reason is that like it can cut survey time by half, and it cuts like pain and suffering by more than half, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I really like it, but it can have like bugs in Qualtrics, but also like people make mistakes. Like I think I wrote for myself that like, not at all like me, I'm a hard worker. And I was like, oh shit. Okay. And then anyway, so that.
You still have a back button, right?
So again, I was gonna say like there is a back button, but like the trade-off is like, people are gonna like know that there's a back, but anyway, because like also, anyway, but yes, that I think that the back button sort of solves it, and maybe we have to have one more screen that says like, this is going to be the quickest survey you ever did, because like as soon as you touch it, like it'll move on, but don't worry, you can go back. And then, you know what I mean, with a cartoon or something.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
But for all you guys who give out surveys, I mean, honestly, thinking about it, it's like instead of 80 clicks, it could be 40 clicks, right? Like it's so much better for the user.
What about the ones that have like a bunch of like 5 questions per page and then click?
Then you can't do, oh, I don't know. You might be able to do auto advance like when you fill out the last one on that page. We just discovered how to do auto advance. So like we're still learning.
I have a little comment. I think this is a really great project. The like with all the items, like because I like my job, etc. I already kind of forgot what was the initial question, to be honest, because we went a bit fast. But like, was the question, why do you have this job, or why do you give your best in this job? And if it's that, then it's also like all the items assume that I'm working hard, right? Because all the items are like, I'm doing it because blah, blah, blah. But there's maybe people who don't even put that much effort into their job a lot, I think. So maybe you have to ask a question about that too before.
Yeah, that is right. And I think it's a hard issue to solve, the pre-assuming that people will accept a question saying like, why do you want to work hard? So the phrasing of the STEM can be somewhat complicated. So we also thought about like, why do you do your job, or like why do you so that made it sort of ambiguous in terms of why are you going to your job, like why do you have that job and don't quit, versus why do you work, like what do you actually put in the work. So yeah, we sort of accepted the presupposition that people would say they actually work hard or actually exert effort, and asked for their motivation for explicitly showing effort rather than actually having a job.
Right. Yeah, I guess that can work. I mean, maybe you can add one item about that, right? One question. I don't know. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it would have helped me if the question was still shown somewhere so I could remember what it was. But
that's very helpful. And I think we could add the STEM in the top of maybe. Like every single item. And I think that could be very helpful.
Yeah, but very great survey. Yeah.
Ben, I've never, can you hear me, Ben?
Yeah.
So I've never taken like a self-concordance survey before. It was really interesting. And I was wondering if intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation are like, if you find that they like are a single continuum. You don't have to spend much time on this because this might be taking off course, but for me, I found that like those are for sure on 2 different axes for me. Like I find myself extremely intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. And I'm wondering if, do you have any brief comments on that? So I don't want to take you off your floor.
Yeah, definitely. I think most of self-determination theory treats autonomous and controlled as 2 factors, as 2 separate factors. And there is some branch within self-determination theory that sort of looks at the difference score as a measure of motivation quality. So I like this idea of like differentiating the quality, which would be the difference, versus the quantity, which would be the sum between the 2. However, like as it relates to outcomes, they're mostly related in a sort of a simplex continuum where you move from the most external to the most internal, the correlations start switching. So you get like -40, -20, +20, +40. So that's sort of, there is some psychometric sort of support for using a different score in that sort of fashion.
So
We still have.
I'm going to ask like a common language thing, like translation of what you said, and then tell me her. So what you're saying is that Danny is experiencing high levels of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and that
Yeah.
it's possible. You don't have to be either or somewhere in the continuum. That it's like you can be high in both. And you're saying for the purpose of what we're doing, we are nevertheless interested in, you know, one minus extrinsic minus or intrinsic minus extrinsic, because you're going to get the biggest score if you have like high intrinsic and low extrinsic. But anyway, it's complicated, and Danny is not like an outlier. Like there are people who experience high levels of both, low levels of both, etc. But there's something very
Definitely.
when there's like a tension, when it's like, oh, I am entirely driven by extrinsic and I'm entirely not driven by intrinsic.
Yeah, that is true. However, we also did for this data just like an hour ago, did some like cluster analysis, which I'll show later that might also inform that. So hang tight for that, Danny.
Yeah, go to the results.
Great.
So let's go to results. So in this new data with 100 participants from Prolific, we have like 97 people after exclusions and stuff. But that's the survey you just took, where we have grid 12 and self-concordance for your job specifically, and emotional exhaustion as a measure of burnout. Again, the sample from, I think this is 23 to 55, there's a typo there. And yeah, so there's a typo here. But the correlation between grid and self-concordance in this sample is higher than the other one. It's 0.51, so that's like very high. And again, this effect is mostly driven by passion rather than perseverance. Here's our correlation table. So we have self-concordance and burnout are related to grit in the directions we would expect. Higher grit is related to higher self-concordance and to lower burnout. And burnout and self-concordance are also negatively related, right? So we also have some control variables you saw, which were how many hours you work, how much do you get paid, but these were unrelated to all of our variables of interest. So we expected these variables to be like interesting compounds or important compounds to control for. However, they weren't actually related to our variables. Here we can see sort of the external, interjected, identified, and intrinsic simplex sort of pattern I was telling Danny, where from the external would be the least autonomous, and then interjected, and then identified, and then intrinsic. And we can see that they relate to grit in this sort of pattern where the most external is the most negative and the most positive is the other. So they sort of lie in a continuum. And for burnout, we have the same sort of pattern where we have burnout is more related to external than to interjected, and then the signs flip for identified and intrinsic, right? So we have this sort of this interesting pattern there.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you go back a slide? Yeah, is it normal to not have perseverance above 4? Like, how come there's no one between 4 and 5? Is this normal?
Yeah, I also thought that was weird, but that's the data. It's just 97 people, so like maybe it's just that like these were people who weren't willing to use the.
That is really weird.
But it is really weird, yeah.
Like really, really weird. Good observation, Julia. Usually perseverance scores are higher than passion scores, and out of 100 people to have nobody like above 3.8 suggests like there's a problem. Okay, so we'll look into that. That's weird, like too weird.
It is very weird, yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's something to do with the auto advance and like, you know, everybody's making at least one error and then like it's creating, you know, I don't know what it is, but it's something weird.
Yeah, I just got a flash that it could be something about the coding, like the scores
Maybe
used by.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't affect the correlations though. If it were something about,
It depends on what it is.
yeah,
But anyway, noted, right?
yeah, that will definitely be checked. So here's our interaction hypothesis and how it turns out. As we can see here by the red square, there is no significant effect of the interaction term. So in a model with just the controls, the mean level of burnout is 2.8. And that is after controlling for our covariates. And then grid and self-concordance both are related, negatively related, and their interaction is not, right? So here in parentheses, we have the standardized coefficients. And the variance explained is like really high, 46% of variance explained is like really high for a model like this. But here we can see that we have basically two additive effects, right? Like the lines are almost parallel. So as you move up in self-concordance, you decrease burnout. And as you move up in grid, you also decrease burnout. So that's the data we have. And that sort of disproves our interaction hypothesis.
So
That's
it
like the
fails to support future.
fails to support. Yeah.
Yeah.
It fails to support our initial hypothesis.
Wild, like, right? Very doctoral student thing. So all of you soon to be doctoral students, it's like, you don't say like, and this proves, or this disproves, because that like puts too much on like one study. So you just say things that are very hedgy and like, this evidence fails to support our hypothesis, or this evidence, right? So Kelly will remember this when she's presenting.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, great, thanks.
That is very true, because of course it doesn't disprove. And that's what I would like to sort of discuss now, right? Why wouldn't there be an interaction? So that's my question to you. And one of the things that I think could be sort of explaining this is restriction on range. Basically, like, we don't have people who are very, very gritty, but very, very low on self-concordance. So I tried to see like what would happen if I did cluster analysis with all of the items and see if I could find a cluster of people that sort of was this sort of demographic we're looking for, and see what is their burnout scores, right? So like we could do like sort of a comparative analysis between clusters. So no matter how hard I tried, there is no way for cluster analysis to find someone with high grit and low self-concordance. So we're going to move through like the 1 cluster, 2 cluster, 3 cluster, 4 cluster, like all of the different possibilities. And I want you to look at these lines here from grit to self-concordance. And we want to see a line that slopes down, right? For high grit leading to low self-concordance. And then we would see how they're in burnout. However, if you keep on doing this, and now we have 2 clusters and both of the lines slope up. If we have 3, both of the lines slope up, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And no matter how you cut up the chicken, there is no way to find a cluster with higher levels of grit and lower levels of self-concordance. All of these lines slope upward unless you're like already very low on grit, and then you can be very low on self-concordance. So I don't know if this is sort of a valid test of this, but I just think that it might be the case that we have some restriction on range problem.
Did you show a plot self-concordance versus grid like on a like the actual
like a regular scatter plot?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is grid and self-concordance, right? So
okay, so that there are people with low self-concordance, but only if they have low grid. Well, that's just a
yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like Paolo's opening question.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, like, so we can move on to mediation and like, I think, so yesterday I was on a call with Julia and also Allison Mackey and like these students who were from different parts of the world in this master's program that Paolo graduated from, the MAP program. And, you know, invariably, whenever I'm in a group where like somebody's from China, right? Like Tingda or Korea, they're the ones who ask like, what if you're like incredibly gritty and they read grit, so they know what I'm talking about. And you don't have passion in the sense of loving what you do. In other words, like in other cultures, I think there are people who work 70 hours a week and are incredibly tenacious about what they're doing, but also do not feel like it. So I don't know that the, high grit, low self-concordance cell is like empty everywhere in the world, or maybe it seems to be particularly empty in like among middle-aged Americans, like on MTurk and Prolific.
Exactly.
And I saw Michelle smiling there. You Asian. We all have stories to tell, so.
Yeah. So.
And if you just do perseverance against grit, no, perseverance against self-concordance, was that a bit more?
It's less. It's less related, right? So like it's here, it's the blue line, right? Which is power of people's 0.34.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So
thank you.
I also have like these models run with the facets of grit and the facets of self-concordance. And we can also look at them, but
let's not look at them. It's not
let's
that
not look at them.
And
one more point, I guess, piggybacking off of what Angela said is like, this is what 100 people from Prolific. And I'm curious what their jobs are, because like it does seem very specific to your position. So a lot of kids are very gritty, but might not like school. So it seems like you could have certain populations where you would find this more or less. And maybe you're not targeting the right population.
Yeah, that's coming. That's coming soon. So next question is, would it make more sense to analyze this as a mediation? So yeah, mediation works. Of course, like this data is all cross-sectional and all self-report. So there is no like evidence of longitudinal order of effects or like causality at all. However, like mediation works, and like 33 of the total mediation effect between grit and burnout is explained by self-concordance. Angela suggested, see what happens when you swap out self-concordance with grit. So I did that, and it's basically the same thing, right? So basically it's 36 here, I'm pointing with my finger. This 36 becomes a 37, this 51 doesn't change, and this 37 becomes a 36, right? So basically, like, yeah, what this is saying is, does this mediation mean anything other than incremental predictive validity? Right. So I think if we wanted to really do a mediation analysis, we would need to sort of have some sort of design that could help us differentiate the mediator from the predictor.
Benjamin, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just in thinking about this. Amy Wisniewski has a scale that measures jobs, careers, and callings. Now, careers people should be high in grit because they want to move ahead, but they're not. Moving ahead is the goal, not what they're doing. Whereas the calling people are self-concordant. So I'm wondering if that would be a way of differentiating, getting to these people who are low in self-concordance but high in grit, and that's a very short scale. It's 10 items. So I'm just thinking that might be useful because a lot of people are on a career mode. That is, they just want to get ahead and maybe get more money, get more prestige, but they're not into what they're doing.
Oh, is the career calling job scale, is it like 10 items, or isn't it like you read these paragraphs and it's like, which of these are?
There are two versions. This comes back to Amy's undergraduate honors thesis, believe it or not. There are two ways. There's one that describes 3 kinds of persons and you rate how much you like them. And the other one is just 10 items, which really come from those paragraphs, but they're just rated how much you agree with them. And they both work quite well.
I think the 10 item one, the problem is that like it literally asks you, like, do you enjoy your work? Like, is it interesting to you? Does it like, and then it becomes like tautological with self-concordance.
Well, do you think your world makes the work makes the world a better place? Do you talk about your work when you're not at the job? You know, there's stuff like that.
Yeah, I know, but not all the items, but some of the items just overlap with like the self-concordance.
So you'd have to look at that.
Yeah, and I think also, Ben, in the data I originally handed off to you, so this is what happens when you go to graduate school. Some professor, well, your professor digs up data that they can't remember anything about, and they give it to you, and they're like, see what this said. I collected this in 1995. So I did this with Ben, and I think we had calling versus career versus job in the original thing that I passed off to you before we started collecting data. If not, I will dig it up and give it to you.
It is 1995. That's very good.
Yeah,
Very good.
you and Amy. Anyway, I think I may have done this already, Paul, so I'll look and see. I can't remember what we found, but I feel like I did this. Paolo will help me find it. It's like the data that Evan Nestorak originally collected.
Yeah, I think I already passed that on to
Oh, okay.
Ben.
Ben
if
can go
that's-
back and look at that. Right, but that's a good point, right, Paul? Like maybe people who are career oriented or hard work. Also, I'm deeply suspicious of like, I'm honestly deeply suspicious of anybody who's on these survey platforms. Like, what are you doing with your life? Get off Prolific. I mean, sorry, if you're an American full-time employee, I can understand like if you're in a country where like this is your only means of like providing for your family, but like, who are you and why are you taking our survey? So I would also like a more, I don't know, non-prolific, non-MTurk sample. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, we want to look at this with like real people, right? So moving on, I also think that the correlations were very high. So does anybody think that demand effects might be inflating the relationship between the variables, as people might be like, yeah, like I know what you're trying to get at. Like, here's what you want, right? So maybe I'm just paranoid, but yeah, that was a sort of question I had. Then this is something that I think might be explaining the data, and I think this is really interesting, and which is that burnout might be more related to the quantity rather than the quality of the motivation, right? So what SET would say is that it's not that controlled motivation never works. It's not that it doesn't move you towards goals. It's just that once the reinforcers are gone, the motivation is also gone, right? So that would mean if you pay your child $5 to make his bed every day, he will make his bed every day, but stop paying him and he will never make the bed again. So contrary to autonomous motivation, where if the child sort of like understands the value and the importance and the reasons why he has to make his bed, you don't need to do anything and he'll do his bed forever until he dies. So I think burnout as a DV could be sort of more related to lack of motivation in total rather than this sort of quality measure. And this effect would appear more longitudinally, because if you're like on the long run, things will happen. Some event will happen that will make you lose this external motivation. And that's when burnout will suddenly appear. And that's when you drop out, right? So I had some conversations, and at least I have two anecdotal cases. I was speaking with a friend, for example, who was like, oh yeah, I want to quit my job. I'm very like dissatisfied. I feel so tired of this. And I asked him why. And of course he said, well, like, it's not something that I very much enjoy, but like I'm doing this work. And when I digged a little bit further, he said, ever since the pandemic started, I'm working more hours from home. I am not getting paid for these extra hours, right? So what this would sort of, what this story would be is that if you have low self-concordance, you will continue to work until something happens that sort of drops this motivation, and then that's when burnout and dropout would happen. So that, of course, is related to this question of burnout requiring more time, right? Like, and then after doing this analysis, I realized we didn't ask this crucial question: how long have you been in your job? Because as we say in Chile and Peru, all of the new brooms are work fine, right? They all work well while they're new. So that's definitely something that we might have wanted to look at. But I would love to hear some of your reactions regarding this.
Okay, I think that's just
So-
on yourself. Go ahead.
Then I had maybe a different potential explanation or something to look into, or something that I wondered about, which is that the domain of the self-concordance questions don't match the domain of the grid items. So that with the grid items, you could be thinking about any domain. They're so general, but the self-concordance are asking about your job specifically.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We are looking at grit as a sort of like a domain general personality sort of characteristic. And I think it's definitely worth it to look at like domain specific grit and even like state grit in the future. So I have some of those in further slides. So what are some of the next steps we have?
By the way, Ben, I think you're getting feedback from Tennille. Like, I think it's good that you're showing us, but it's not like that's the only feedback he wants. He's not like going to just take one question. But given that Tennille raised that, why don't you keep going? In other words, you took a question from Tennille, and then we're moving on. But it's not because we're like done with getting feedback. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to see that thing that you're going to show because it was related. But I just wanted to signal to the audience that we're going to continue to get feedback in the next 12 minutes.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay.
So as we said, maybe this like interaction occurs at higher levels of exertion, right? Like maybe we are not looking at people who are like working hard enough, gritty enough to sort of feel so tired by having non-self-concordant motivation. So we spoke to George Lin, who might be on this call. And he has a sample, or he is familiar with this sample of Chinese American weekend school students. So these are students who go to like the regular school during the week, and then on the weekends they go to Chinese American school to study more math and more language and more everything, so that they can get into a top school, into certain prestigious professions like doctors and lawyers. And there we would expect higher levels of grit, of course, because these kids are like working so hard, but also more unrelated to motivation quality, because it's likely that a big subset of them would say things like, yeah, I'm coming here because my mom makes me. It's not that I like really much enjoy and see the fun in coming to Sunday school to study more math. Here are also some possible limitations with this whole line of research is the problem of self-awareness and desirability bias, right? So like, will people actually know? Would they be able to sort of identify these lack of self-concordant feelings within themselves? And if they did, would they be able to say it, right? Would they be, would they say it? So I think what we could do is sort of do some sort of like cross-lagged panel model where we have dropout, burnout, and how that relates to grit and the self-concordance of their career plans for the future, right? So like if I'm
It's like 12 years old.
I'm sorry?
Aren't these kids like kids? Like, do they have career plans for the future?
I don't know. But like maybe,
Is
yeah,
George
like,
here? He must be stuck in a COVID assignment. He works on COVID emergency. He would have been here otherwise. But the kids go from about 5 years of age to 18, and their parents have set up, most of them have set their career for them. It's usually medicine. So they're not a party to that. And I think that's probably true from early, but George would know that, how early in their lives their career line is set for them.
yeah. So yeah, definitely we need to look more into like what age groups would be the most relevant to, but I'm thinking this could be some further next steps to sort of get at this interaction or what is happening when there is high grit but low self-concordance. I also think that in this sort of like longitudinal study, dropout or change of intentions might be also something interesting to look at.
By the way, in post-Chinese schools, I've been working with George on this, folks. Post-Chinese schools, they go to college and their parents determine their major, because it's pre-med, so that this problem continues all the way through college, and for many of them, professional school. So it's not just Chinese, their attendance in Chinese schools, it's the continuation with their major, and they're going on to the proper professional schools. There's burnout at all those levels.
Right, but then you have to do a 25-year longitudinal study. I mean, I think that is one of the challenges. I think you can go a really long way.
It doesn't have to be longitudinal. You have 25, 30, 35-year-olds who've been through this.
Oh, you just like get people who are like 35 and then measure their grit and their self-concordance, and then you get a snapshot, but you might see it. I mean, that's what he just did on Prolific, but like maybe with a sample of people for whom there are people who are high grit and low self-concordance.
Couldn't you also ask them when you were 18? I mean, it's just retrospective data, but it's helpful what their situation was at that time. Did they burn out at any point in the past in any of these prescribed activities? I think people are likely to remember big things like that. Anyway, it's possible.
That would definitely be interesting. And I'm also thinking about, like, if we did a longitudinal study, how accurate are these recollections?
Yes.
I think would also be something interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Our initial sort of planned next step before doing this was doing this sort of same study with longitudinal and objective outcomes, where we would have grit and self-concordance of academic goals, predicting academic achievement and well-being, controlling for prior academic achievement and well-being, right? So we would also expect, we also expected this sort of like interaction, but when looked at longitudinally and objectively.
So you expect what specifically? That like the kids who do well the best academically are gritty and actually intrinsically love school?
Intrinsically love school, yeah. They're both self-concordant and gritty. So that would be like the good combination. And initially we expected the interaction to be true, meaning there's a multiplicative effect where grit and self-concordance are synergistic rather than just additive, right? But we didn't see the interaction in this particular data. So we don't know what would happen looked at it if we looked at it in an academic context and longitudinally with objective outcomes.
So this is Julia's idea. I mean, not Julia's idea, like she scooped you, like as in she was suggesting this like 30 minutes ago. Right, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry. I think that this is a really great idea. And it kind of gets closer to the question, which is like, you know, what is grit without passion and what are the consequences in a real world setting? I mean, I'm also an experimentalist, so I can think of like experiments you could do with this, where you could assign people to conditions where they like the domain they're working in and they care about it versus not, and see how it actually affects their real world performance in that moment or persistence.
Yeah.
How do you randomly assign people to like something though? Like give me an example of how you would do that.
Okay, so I mean, with kids or something, you would give them like 3 cartoon characters and you would say which one of these is your favorite, and they would rank it, and then you'd either assign them to that condition with the cartoon character or with chess if they care about chess more than basketball. And you could have it all be the same game basically, but with like a different theme. There's different ways to do it. So you could make them think that they're doing something that's getting them better in a domain they care about versus not, or you could actually have them work in a domain that they care about versus not.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Ben, just as you put this up, I think cheating would be a good thing to look at, and like superficial learning. I mean, like, anyway, apparently kids cheat a lot, and apparently they do a ton of superficial, like the most like cursory kind of like, what do I have to do to get, so that would be somehow good.
Definitely. So I'll just take the next 5 minutes to sort of think a little bit more long-term and sort of share some sort of semi-random ideas.
While Ben does that, just like, if you have other questions or comments in the chat, we'll save the chat. So Ben, keep going, like bring us home. But for those of you who have other additional questions or comments, you can chat them while Ben's doing that.
Yes, please do, so I can review those later. So here are other ways to link grit and self-determination theory more generally. And the first thing I thought about is that grit might affect self-concordance change. So people can become more self-concordant or lose self-concordance. And there's this idea that sort of we can learn to love something, especially if we get good at it, right? And that relates to self-determination theory's need for competence, which is like a basic universal human need, right? So I would expect that if you are working really hard at something, meaning if you're gritty and you're capable of doing hard work, and you're also like good enough at it where you can improve enough, I would expect that in that domain, you would sort of learn to love that thing. And that's really interesting because it's contrary to the original burnout idea. It's sort of like the same thing. It's very similar to the same thing. But whereas one sort of suggests a deteriorating path, the other one sort of supports a more path where you're learning to love something you originally didn't like. So one thing that I think might be sort of interesting is sort of mindsets that might be associated with this. And I think there's this like idea of that everything can be interesting in the sort of like primal Jerry Clifton idea that you may be familiar with, but I just thought that this could be interesting to look at further. Then there's the question of intrapersonal variability. So usual self-concordance research would aggregate all the data at the individual level. However, within level variance might be very interesting, and we might behave differently for different goals. We might have at the same time goals that are more or less self-concordant, and might have specific grit for these goals that is different. So this like intrapersonal variability question might also be interesting. Then I also thought about this idea of how the development of grit requires exploration. So I think introjection specifically as a source of controlled motivation might block the attention in a way that makes it really hard to evaluate, are we really liking these things I'm trying? So if I'm exploring, that usually leads to passion development, right? Because I'm trying new things, I'm getting to realize what do I like and what don't I like. However, if I am very much moved by introjection, I'm worried about how I'm being perceived by other people. Maybe I'm not able to realize these internal signals. I'm not able to pay attention to them. So I'm not able to see, oh yeah, like I really liked going to this medicine camp, because I am actually paying attention to how are my parents reacting to the fact that I did this or didn't do this, or how much I achieved or didn't achieve, right? So my attention is not into the internal signals as feedback, but rather on the other people. I'm not focusing on myself, I'm focusing on others. So that sort of makes the exploration useless in terms of developing grit. So that's just like some idea I was thinking about. So those are my random ideas for future grit and STT studies. And let me finish with the take-home messages. Where grit might have connotations of controlled motivation, but it's really associated with autonomous motivation and self-concordance. In a pilot sample of prolificers, they're both protective against burnout, but do not interact in predicting it. Maybe mediation is a more suitable way to analyze this data. And of course, we need longitudinal designs and more specific samples to elaborate this idea. And there are different possible ways to interface grit and self-determination theory research. So that's all.
I have a quick thought, if I may. Steve Heine and some others did a study some time ago that Angela may know. They had Japanese and American kids doing two activities. The first one was shooting 10 basketballs, okay? And then they got a score, how many foul shots they hit. And then they had a choice of continuing that or doing another activity. And the Japanese kids, the worse they did on the foul shooting, the more they would take another 10. And the Americans, the better they did, the more they would take another 10. That is to say, the Japanese kids had versatility as an end point. Now, versatility is an interesting end point, being good at a lot of things, because it's very complicated to interact with grit. You can have grit to be diverse. Ironically, that's what this raises, this interesting possibility. To be a well-rounded person could be your end.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and it sort of like looks at possible cultural moderation of the phenomenon of like, of like how being good at something or bad at something actually helps you persevere or not.
See, we believe that you're as good as your best thing, but you could believe you're as good as your worst thing.
That's really interesting.
Okay, so I think we should end here, but I'm reading all the questions. These are great. We won't, Paolo will save the chat. And then thank you so much. This is what lab meetings are for. If anybody has any interest in like continuing this conversation, if you could email Ben, you're welcome to copy me. That would be great. I was looking for collaborators. All right, awesome. Good job, Ben. Well done.
Thank you very much. And thanks all for being here. It's wonderful to hear all your thoughts.
All right, terrific. Paolo, you gonna save the chat?
Hmm?
No, I was asking Paolo to save the chat.
Yeah, already done that.
All right, awesome.
Should be
Okay,
open the recording. Okay, bye.
we'll be brief. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.